When John Wayne passed away in 1979, the world stopped for a moment. He was not just a movie star. He was a symbol. To many Americans, John Wayne represented strength, pride, and old-school values. His funeral was expected to be one of the biggest Hollywood gatherings of the era. Actors, directors, politicians, and industry leaders were all expected to attend. Cameras waited. Reporters took notes. The public watched closely. But as names were checked and faces were counted, people noticed something strange. One famous Western actor was not there. Lee Van Cleef, a man who had appeared in the same genre, the same era, and sometimes even the same films as John Wayne, was missing. There was no statement, no explanation, no apology, just silence. Over time, that silence became louder than words. Fans began to ask questions. Why wasn't he there? Was he sick? Was he busy? Or was there a deeper reason? To understand that absence, we need to understand the kind of man Lee Van Cleef really was, because his life followed a very different path than John Wayne's, even though both men rode horses, carried guns, and helped define the Western genre. Lee Van Cleef was born Clarence Leroy Van Cleef, Jr. on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey. He did not come from wealth or Hollywood connections. His family lived a simple life, and he grew up during the Great Depression. This was a hard time in America, and it shaped him deeply. He learned discipline early. He learned to live with less. He learned to rely on himself. Before acting ever entered his life, he served his country during World War II. He joined the United States Navy and became part of an underwater demolition team, a dangerous unit that later became known as the early version of the Navy SEALs. This was not movie bravery. This was real danger, explosives, deep water, and missions where mistakes meant death. That experience changed him. It made him quiet. It made him serious. And it made him deeply private. When the war ended, Lee Van Cleef returned home, carrying experiences he rarely spoke about. Acting came later, almost by accident. He studied theater and began finding small roles on stage and television. When Hollywood noticed him, it was not because he looked like a hero. He did not have the smooth smile or broad jaw that studios loved at the time. Instead, he had sharp features, narrow eyes, and a thin frame. Those traits pushed him into villain roles. He became the man who stood behind the main bad guy, the gunman who died early, the outlaw who spoke few words. He worked constantly, but rarely received praise. John Wayne's path was very different. Wayne became a star early. Studios built films around him. Directors trusted him. Producers listened to him. He represented power within Hollywood. He played heroes who stood tall, spoke clearly, and always seemed sure of themselves. He was proud, loud, and confident. Lee Van Cleef, on the other hand, stayed in the background. He showed up, did his job, and went home. He did not play the Hollywood game. He did not attend parties often. He did not chase attention. Even when he appeared in famous films like High Noon and Shane, his name was barely noticed. Yet audiences remembered his face. There was something about him, a cold calm, a quiet threat, something real. Still, Hollywood never gave him the same respect it gave men like John Wayne. By the late 1950s, Van Cleef's career slowed down. Then tragedy struck. A serious car accident crushed his knee. Doctors warned him he might never walk properly again. Acting seemed finished. He stepped away, worked regular jobs, and lived quietly. During this time, John Wayne's star only grew brighter. The gap between them widened. They existed in the same world, but lived very different lives. This difference matters, because it helps explain why Lee Van Cleef never felt the need to take part in Hollywood rituals, including public funerals. In the mid-1960s, something unexpected happened. An Italian director named Sergio Leone saw Lee Van Cleef in an old American Western and noticed something Hollywood had ignored. Leone did not care about traditional heroes. He cared about faces that told stories. Pain, regret, strength earned the hard way. He cast Van Cleef in for a few dollars more, alongside Clint Eastwood. This role changed everything. For the first time, Van Cleef was not just a villain. He was a man with depth, a man driven by loss, a man who did not speak much because he did not need to. Audiences loved him. Then came the good, the bad, and the ugly, as Angel Eyes. Van Cleef created one of the most unforgettable villains in film history. He did not shout. He did not overact. He simply watched, waited, moved with purpose. This success finally made him a star, but it happened late in his life. By then, he had already learned not to trust Hollywood praise. He knew how quickly it disappeared. Fame did not change him. If anything, it confirmed what he already believed, that respect should be earned quietly, not demanded publicly. This belief shaped how he lived and how he responded to events around him. While John Wayne embraced his image as an American icon, Van Cleef stayed distant from symbolism. He did not see himself as a legend. He saw himself as a working man who had survived war, injury, and rejection. He respected talent, but not celebrity worship. By the time John Wayne passed away, Van Cleef was living mostly outside the Hollywood spotlight. He chose roles carefully. He painted. He spent time with animals. He avoided crowds. Funerals in Hollywood are often public events. They are filled with cameras, speeches, and appearances. For some actors, attending is expected. For Lee Van Cleef, it may have felt dishonest. Not because he hated John Wayne, but because public mourning was not how he expressed respect. People who knew Van Cleef described him as gentle and thoughtful, but also deeply private. He did not share feelings publicly. He processed emotions alone. For him, absence did not mean disrespect. It meant staying true to himself. Rumors grew because silence allows imagination to run wild. Some said he disagreed with Wayne's politics. Others claimed old professional tension. But there is no proof of a personal feud. What we do know is this: Lee Van Cleef never chased approval. He never shaped his actions to please Hollywood. He did not attend events because they were expected. He attended only when they felt meaningful to him. By skipping the funeral, he made a quiet statement without ever speaking. He refused to perform grief. He refused to turn emotion into a public show. In a city built on image, that decision stood out. It confused people because it did not fit the usual pattern. But for Van Cleef, it fit perfectly. His entire life had been about walking his own path. From war to film sets, from fame to isolation, he stayed consistent. The same man who avoided attention during success would avoid it during loss. As time passed, Lee Van Cleef's absence from John Wayne's funeral became part of Hollywood legend. But when we look closely at his life, the mystery becomes less dramatic and more human. He was not a man of gestures. He was a man of actions. He believed respect was personal, not public. Attending a funeral surrounded by cameras may have felt wrong to him. Not attending allowed him to grieve or reflect in his own way. In later years, Van Cleef continued working, appearing in films like Escape from New York and The Octagon. Even then, he never chased relevance. He chose roles that interested him. When his career slowed, he accepted it calmly. He had already lived many lives: sailor, soldier, struggling actor, late-blooming star, artist. When he passed away in 1989, there was no controversy, just quiet respect from those who truly knew his work. In the end, the story is not really about John Wayne's funeral. It is about two very different men representing two very different versions of Hollywood. One stood in the spotlight, the other stood in the shadows. One embraced ceremony, the other embraced silence. Lee Van Cleef did not need to be seen to be remembered. His absence was not an insult. It was a reflection of who he had always been. A man who lived by his own rules. A man who never performed for the crowd. And sometimes, the loudest statement is simply choosing not to show up. When John Wayne passed away in June of 1979, the entire film world seemed to stop. For decades, John Wayne had been more than just a movie star. To many Americans, he was a symbol. He stood for strength, confidence, and a very clear idea of what a hero should be. His characters were tough, brave, and certain of themselves. He did not hesitate. He did not doubt. Whether he was playing a cowboy, a soldier, or a lawman, John Wayne always felt larger than life. Because of this, his death felt personal to millions of fans. When news of his funeral spread, it was expected that Hollywood would come together in full force. And it did. Actors, directors, politicians, and public figures all attended. The church was filled with familiar faces, and the event was covered with great respect. However, among all those who came to honor John Wayne, one well-known actor was missing. That actor was Lee Van Cleef. His absence was noticed almost immediately, especially by people who understood the history of classic Hollywood. Lee Van Cleef did not attend the funeral. He did not make a public statement. He did not explain himself. And in an industry where appearances often mattered more than honesty, his silence spoke loudly. To understand why Lee Van Cleef chose not to attend John Wayne's funeral, it is important to understand who Lee Van Cleef was and how different his path was from Wayne's. Lee Van Cleef was never built to be Hollywood's favorite hero. He had a sharp face, narrow eyes, and a serious expression that made him perfect for villains and dangerous characters. From early in his career, he was often cast as the bad guy. He played outlaws, killers, and men with unclear morals. While John Wayne was usually placed at the center of the story, Lee Van Cleef was often pushed to the edges. He was not the man the audience was meant to cheer for. He was the man they feared or questioned. This was not because he lacked talent. In fact, many who worked with him believed he was deeply skilled and thoughtful as an actor. But Hollywood at that time had very strict ideas about image. John Wayne fit the image of the strong American hero perfectly. Lee Van Cleef did not. This difference shaped their careers and also shaped how each man saw the film industry. John Wayne had enormous power in Hollywood. He could influence casting decisions, control how films were made, and shape the atmosphere on set. Many actors admired him for this. They saw him as a leader, someone who knew exactly what he wanted. But Lee Van Cleef saw things differently. To him, that power was not inspiring. It was controlling. Over the years, Lee Van Cleef shared with friends that he believed Wayne used his influence to dominate others. He felt that Wayne often demanded obedience rather than collaboration. According to Van Cleef, if an actor did not agree with Wayne or did not fit his idea of how things should be done, that actor was pushed aside. Whether this view was shared by everyone or not, it was real and deeply felt by Lee Van Cleef.